page 555, continued. Types of poetry. The 15th century was a period of singular barrenness as regards literary production, particularly poetry. No poet of the century comes anywhere near Chaucer, who dominated the previous century like a colossus. We have in the 15th century a number of sons of Geoffrey, or what we call the Chaucerians, who professedly imitated the great master. Imitation in its broader implications is nor a bad or a despicable activity. Imitation in its broader implications is not a bad nor a despicable activity. But we find that the Chaucerians of the 15th century imitated Chaucer too slavishly and mechanically, so that their imitations could capture only the trappings and not the vigorous body or the subtle soul of Chaucer's poetry. Moreover, very few of these Chaucerians thought of imitating the best work of Chaucer, namely the Canterbury Tales. They restricted their attention to his allegorical and dream poetry, which is far below his best. Para. As regards drama and prose, the age was not so unproductive, however. Sir Thomas Malory and Caxton in particular contributed not meanly to the development and fixation of English prose. A sense of style also came in. Caxton, Caxton, is an important figure in the history of English literature, as it was he who initiated the art of printing in England. In his preface to his publications, he wrote refreshing, natural and personal style, which has earned for him a secure place in the history of English prose. The introduction of the art of printing in England made books available at cheap prices to the commonalty. Literacy also increased considerably, and literature, hitherto a privileged pursuit of the elite, became more, quote, popular, unquote, in the true sense of the word. Let us discuss the salient features and trends of the poetry of the 15th century. Para. Allegorical and dream poetry. Allegorical and dream poetry. Most of the imitators of Chaucer set their sights on imitating his minor work and not the ne plus ultra of his poetic art, namely the Canterbury Tales. The works of Chaucer which most readily came in for imitation were the following three. 1. The Parliament of Fowls. 2. The Book of the Duchess. And 3. The House of Fame. Page 556. Para. All these works are but mediocre in quality and were written by Chaucer obviously in imitation of the well-known tradition of dream and allegory so popular with the medieval English poets. None of them display any direct first-hand contact with life or reality, as the Canterbury Tales so abundantly and so superbly does. The work of Chaucer's imitators is naturally enough remote from reality. The lesson of the Canterbury Tales and the quote, fresh woods and pastures new, unquote, opened up by Chaucer seem to have held no attraction for the Chaucerians. For the most part entrenched in the medieval tradition, they failed to capture the real-life freshness of Chaucer's poetry. The poet usually found himself dreaming and taken to a garden, and they involved in some stock incidents in which figured such stock characters as the goddess of love and various virtues and vices in personified forms. William Dunbar's The Golden Targe, Targe, and Lydgate's Temple of Glass are poems of this kind. In the former, the poet falls asleep on a May morning in a garden and dreams of a ship full of 100 allegorical ladies of King Cupid's court. Reason with his golden target shield tries unsuccessfully to protect the poet from the arrows of love. Stephen Hawes, Hwes, in his example of virtue relates the story of a youth who, led by reason, succeeds finally in marrying Purity, the daughter of the king of love. His pastime of pleasure and Dunbar's The Thistle and the Rose provide some more examples of the allegorical dream poetry. Some of these poems might have provided Spenser with some germinal hints. It was only Hoccleve, Hoccleve, perhaps, who to some extent continued the tradition of English city life as it was sketched in the Canterbury Tales. His picture of London in La Mel Regale is not uninteresting. Para. Satire and didacticism. 15 poets followed Langland and Morel Cower, Cower, too, in the practice of satire and didacticism. Chaucer had nothing of the reformer or the preacher in him, and his forte was not satire but naughty irony. But Langland in Piers and the Ploughman, and Gower in all his major works, aimed at different effects. Their lead is more particularly accepted by John Skelton, the rugged satirist of the 15th century. He hits very crudely indeed, though he hits very hard. He is well known for his satires on the clergy, but is best known for the boldness with which he attacked the all-powerful Wolsey, Wolsey. William Dunbar continued the satiric tradition in a major part of his poetic output. His satire is generally of the nature of jovial invective, but sometimes takes up the colour of Rabelaisian, Rebelaisan, grotesquerie, grotesquery, as, for instance, in his Dance of the Seven Deadly Scenes. Para. The Eclogue. The 15th century is known for the appearance of the Virgilian eclogue, Eclogue, as a new genre in English literature. An eclogue is generally a short poem, especially a pastoral dialogue, generally between shepherds and shepherdesses, written in the manner of Virgil and Theocritus. The man who introduced the eclogue in England was Alexander Barclay, the translator of the famous work of the German poet Sebastian Brandt, entitled by him The Ship of Fools. His eclogues were mainly modelled upon those of the Italian poet Mantuanus, Mantuanus, and have elements of satire which we find absent from those of Virgil. Barclay's forte is his mastery of detail and his very effective handling of the dialogue between his shepherds. Further, his work contains plentiful references to current English affairs. Para. The attitude of the poet to his work determines the type or kind of poetry. His attitude may be one of the following two kinds. 1. The poet may distance himself from his theme, stands apart as an onlooker, and with a detached and dispassionate mind describes the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of the characters who people his world. This is called the objective method, and the result is narrative or epic poetry. 2. The poet may concentrate primarily on his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences as affected by external circumstances. He expresses himself in his own person or through some personality he assumes for the time being. This is known as the subjective method, and the result is lyric poetry. Para. Epic poetry. The following are the distinctive qualities of the epic. 1. It is a long narrative poem. 2. It is objective in character. It embodies the thoughts and feelings of the whole race rather than those of an individual. 3i. The characters are of the heroic type and their actions and subjects to the intervention of gods and controlled by destiny. Unity is achieved by concentration on one main character. Page 557. 1iv. The style of the epic is grand, marked by dignity and sublimity. V. The same meter is used throughout. Para. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia are some famous epics. Para. The mock epic. In it, the form and conventions of the epic proper are used to narrate a trivial theme. The resulting incongruity is applied to the purposes of humor or ridicule. Butler's Hudibras and Pope's The Rep of the Lock are outstanding examples of this form. The ballad. The ballad is another gift of the 15th century to English literature. Ballads constituted a considerable part of English folk literature. They were transmitted orally from one generation to the next. Most of the ballads in England remain anonymous and, according to the older critical opinion as represented by F. B. Gummere, Gummere, in the beginning of Poetry 1901, they had a communal origin. That is, they were authored not by individuals but by the community as a whole. Modern critical opinion, however, is inclined against the communal theory of the origin of the ballad. Para. The ballad originally existed as some song accompanying a folk dance, but later it came to signify a short narrative poem told impersonally with some dramatic interest in more or less a traditional metrical form. Most commonly, the stanza employed by it consists of 4 lines, the second and fourth rhyming together. The first and the third lines contain 4 stresses and the other 2 3 each. See, for instance, the opening verse of Sir Patrick Spens, quote, "The king sits in Dumferling tone, T-O-U-N-E, comma, drinking the blood red wine, quote, oh, what will I get a gilt sailor, comma, to sail this ship of mine, question mark, unquote." Para. The themes of most of the ballads are love, domestic tragedy, war, history, and the supernatural. The popular ballads, some 30 in number, concerning Robin Hood and his coat, merry men, unquote, are a class by themselves. Robin Hood is, in Albert C. Bowes-Bird's quote, the people's counterpart of aristocratic heroes like Sir Gawain, unquote, stop. He is honest and God-fearing, but bosses over and robs the cruel rich to mitigate the penury of the poor. The most popular ballads dating from the 15th century are the Nut Brown Maid and Chevy Chase. The former is of the nature of a true love poem, and the latter concerns itself with the heroic fight between the English Sir Percy and the Scottish Sir Douglas. Even in the cultured 18th century, these ballads were acclaimed as wonderful literature. Prior based his Henry and Emma upon the Nut Brown Maid, and Addison in his Spectator brought out the beauties of Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase is couched in the traditional ballad meter referred to above, but the Nut Brown Maid is written in stanzas of 12 lines each. Along with the ballads, in the 15th century there was a great outpouring of lyric verse dealing with both religious and secular themes. Para. Versification. As regards versification, all the poets of the 15th century looked back to Chaucer for guidance. Very few new prosodic forms were adopted by them. In fact, instead of advancement, the prosodic part of English poetry showed signs of retrogression, if not outright decadence. Very few poets seem to have had an ear for music. Chaucer was perhaps the first English poet who instinctively grasped the hidden music of English words, but 15th century Chaucerians did not benefit from the shining example before them. Much confusion and disharmony were created when the final quote, E unquote, was dropped in the 15th century. That put before the poets a garbled version of Chaucer poetry, which inaccurately read started jarring upon the ear. His followers misread and miscopied Chaucer. Their own poetry shows a lamentable neglect, if not ignorance, of all the basic laws of prosody. Lydgate was the most egregious offender in this respect, and was frank enough to admit, quote, I took none heed neither of short nor long, unquote, stop. Skelton and Hawes were other notable offenders. The former indeed admitted that the rhyme rime was ragged, ragged, and jagged, jagged. In his contempt of all verbal music, he might have given a cue to Donne and his fellow metaphysicals. All the three principal meters employed by Chaucer, namely the heroic couplet, the octosyllabic couplet with 4 stresses in each line, and the Chaucerian stanza were widely employed by the poets of the 15th century. But none of them exhibited in his handling of these measures the easy facility and unforced mastery of Chaucer. Para. Strictly speaking, the ballad has no place in a history of English literature. To treat of it as one of the literary forms such as the epic, the ode, or the sonnet is quite erroneous. Page 558. The true ballad is lore, L-O-R-E, rather than what is known literature, or even the alphabet. It had its origin and growth at a time before literature or even the alphabet came to be written and read. To find the ballad by the side of such literary genres as the epic and the sonnet is as disturbing as finding the prehistoric ichthyosaur, ichthyosaur, in the company of other animals in a modern zoo. The ichthyosaur has had its day, and so has the ballad. The ballad dies when literature comes, just as the ichthyosaur was extinct before the more highly developed forms of life came to their own. The ballad flourishes as long as the means of communication are wholly oral. The arrival of the alphabet and literature, written literature, is a herald of the death of the ballad, as of the rest of folk literature whose dissemination and preservation depend entirely on oral means. But what about the ballads, quote, written unquote, by the poets such as Rossetti, Coleridge, and Scott? These ballads may be called literary ballads, but they are not ballads proper, because they do not have folk origin, which is synonymous and with a peculiar kind of anonymity. Para. Origin. We have emphasized above the folk origin of the true ballad, but when that is said, still there is need for clarification. In fact, the origin of the true ballad is shrouded in a nebula and is more a matter of conjecture than of scientific demonstration. If we examine the etymology of the word ballad, we may be helped a little in the job of ascertaining the origin of the ballad. Let us see how. The word ballad is derived from the word ballar, B-A-L-L-E-R, which means to dance. What is exactly the connection between the ancient ballad and dancing? This question takes us further backward to the wider consideration of the origin of all folk literature. Para. One can easily recognize the universal human instinct for accompanying all regular bodily movements with vocal expressions. This instinct is more clearly marked when regular bodily movements are being made by a group of people, but is to be seen even when a lonely individual is involved. Thus, a man singing in a bathroom, even as he is performing the job of cleaning his body with more or less regular movements, can be easily imagined. A group of men heaving at a log or reaping the harvest, or of women weaving together, break almost invariably and involuntarily into ejaculations with or without meaning. Dancing, as will be readily granted, involves more regular bodily movements than anything else. Group dancing practiced by ancient communities to celebrate this or that festival then must have come to be accompanied by vocal ejaculations, which later must have assumed a more coherent shape. This is how folk literature and the ballad must have originated. Thus, the connection between dancing and the ballad has to be considered in this perspective. Para. Authorship. So the ballad must be taken as a later and more sophisticated form of the primitive communal song sung to the accompaniment of ritual dancing in celebration of some occasions. But one important point which has been controversial needs elucidation still, the one concerning the authorship of the old ballads. The question is, are these ballads the product of collective effort or that of some particular individuals? It is even today a moot point, but there is another point, and one allied to this one, about which there is no controversy, that the ballad, as it has some sophistication about it which is not shared by the communal song, requires for its conception and writing a kind of artistry, individual or communal. What strikes one about an ancient ballad so abundantly is its downright, quote, impersonality, unquote, or, quote, anonymity, unquote, stop. Not that the authorship of these ballads, which have survived the mutations of taste for numerous centuries, is indeterminable. Rather, it is so said by a school of critics. They did not have individual writers as their authors. The whole of the community is credited by these critics with the authorship of these ballads. They contend that a ballad, unlike a literary composition, is not written down by a writer once and for all. Rather, on account of being transmitted down the generations by wholly oral means, it is modified by every new generation in accordance with its own predilections. Thus, the latest version of a ballad, even though highly different from its original one, is to be considered as authentic as the original. John Roy, Jeanroy, Abercrombie, and Child, for example, favor this view, which emphasizes the impersonality of the ballad, ascribing to it communal rather than individual authorship. Para. But this view, quite sound fundamentally, yet errs to an extreme and has now been wholly discarded. Leguy points out, quote, it has even been supposed that a ballad is the spontaneous and joint composition of a group of people. Stop. Page 559. Reflection shows, however, that this theory has little plausibility. There could be agreement for these purposes of poetry among a number of people only in the sharing of a passion, and the work of an artist or several successive artists has to be recognized in a ballad of any length. Stop. It was artist, however primitive, who interpreted the multitude, unquote. Stop. We may agree with F. J. Child that so far as a ballad is concerned, quote, the author counts for nothing, unquote, but we cannot say that a ballad has no definite author or authors. A ballad is impersonal in one sense only, namely that the personality of its author or authors is of little importance in understanding and interpreting it. It expresses the personality not of an individual but of a community. The author never uses personal pronouns, nor does he reveal his personality by comments on the action or characters. Still he does count for something. Para. Stylistic and other conventions. A ballad is always a narrative which is told in a particular way in accordance with some conventions. As a narrative, it generally confines itself to a single episode. In this respect, it is easily distinguished from an epic which covers a plethora of episodes spread over a number of years. A ballad, though narrative, is often dramatic in effect, for it has that condensation which is peculiar to drama, and not the sprawling diffuseness of the epic, whose material would, as Aristotle says, suffice for a number of tragedies. The ballad, to quote a critic, quote, sought to impress by the vivid representation of a single event, to bring home to the bearer its wonder, its pathos, its fatefulness or its horror, unquote. Stop. As it was oral literature, something to be sung and heard rather than written and read, it depended for its emotional effect upon music. The refrain sung by the chorus was its peculiar feature. The singer, after having sung a few lines, was followed by the chorus singing the refrain. The refrain is of most frequent occurrence in the continental ballads than the English, because the latter were generally of the chronicle type, in which the narrative did not allow too frequent interruptions. Para. Apart from the regular refrain, frequent repetitions are also a common feature of the ancient ballad. Such repetitions, dexterously handled, make for a peculiar intensification of emotional effect rather than simple embellishment of style. Note the use of repetition in the following lines from Clerk Saunders. Quote, is there any room at your head, Saunders, ? Is there any room at your feet, ? Or any room at your side, Saunders, where fain I would sleep, ? Unquote. Quote, there is no room at my head, Margaret. There is no room at my feet, semicolon. My bed, it is full of lowly now, among the hungry worms I sleep, unquote. Stop. The pathos of these lines does not need any comment. Para. The style of the ancient ballads is altogether down to earth, absolutely free from literary ornament, attitudinization, or empty bow-wow. Its very simplicity and directness are its intrinsic strength. Even such a sophisticated man of tellers of Renaissance England as Sir Philip Sidney was compelled to pay a special tribute to the rude strength and simple directness of old English ballads. Writing in his Apology for Poetry about the ballad of Chevy Chase, he confided that his heart was moved by it, quote, more than with a trumpet, unquote. Stop. And Joseph Addison, the sophisticated Mr. Spectator, writing in the Augustan age, was also full of admiration for the same qualities of this ballad. Para. As regards meter and versification also, the ballad has the qualities of simplicity and directness. A ballad follows one of the several traditional stanzaic patterns. The more usual ballad stanza consists of 4 lines of 8 and 6 syllables alternately. The second and the fourth lines generally rhyme, and the lines usually follow the iambic movement, but variations are not infrequent. Para. Themes. Themes of most ballads are provided by the more usual human passions in their intense and unsophisticated forms, such as love, lust, hate, and jealousy. As most ancient ballads are the product of a basically pagan, even though nominally Christian culture, very few of them, such as Dives and Lazarus, have religious or biblical themes. 1/3 of them are about love. Quite a few of them are frankly about the supernatural, such as evil spirits, mermaids, ghouls, and even the devil himself. Thus, in The Demon Lover, we have the account of a beautiful woman betrayed by an evil spirit who comes to her in the shape of a handsome man. Some of the ballads indulging in the supernatural keep things shrouded in mystery, but still strike the reader with a sense of wonder. Thus, in James Harris, we meet a woman who, in the absence of her husband for 7 years, marries a carpenter, but is lured by an evil spirit who appears to her in the guise of her presumably dead husband. Page 560. Quote, "And so together away they went from off the English shore." Stop. When they went, and with what consequences, and even why, are questions left completely unanswered. Para. Love and strong but baser human passions. Love and strong but baser human passions provide the usual themes for most ballads. The proverbial jealousy of the stepmother, the cruelty of brothers, usually 7 in number, of the woman who desires the love of a man against their wishes, the treachery of a confidant, etc., are to be met with quite often in the old ballads. In Clerk Saunders, the lover is killed while asleep by the side of the heroine by her 7 brothers. She finds him murdered only when she gets up next morning. In Young Hunting, the strong-minded heroine kills her lover after becoming convinced of his infidelity, but he comes in the form of a bird to reveal the murder. In The Cruel Sister, we have a sister who kills another out of sheer rivalry. Babylon is the story of an outlaw who tries to make love to 2 sisters and kills them both on being rejected. He learns that they are his own sisters and then kills himself. A number of ballads called the quote, border ballads unquote, deal with the English-Scottish skirmishes on the border between England and Scotland, bringing out the bravery of the heroes on both sides. Para. Another group of ballads, some 30 in number, called quote, Robin Hood ballads unquote, deals with the exploits of the kind and generous outlaw named Robin Hood and his followers who believed in a kind of socialism. Robin Hood is presented as a friend of the poor and an enemy of the rich whom he robs for the sake of the former. He is a patriot but does not scruple to leave on the king's deer. He rescues women being married to the grooms they hate to restore them to their sweethearts. He corrects the wrongs of justice by hanging the sheriff and rescuing the men wrongly condemned, and so on. Para. The ballad has the following characteristics. 1. It is the product of a people and not the individual work of a poet. 2. It is objective in treatment. 3. It usually relates a tale Love, hatred, pity, war, hunting, the supernatural are its common themes. 4. Originally it was associated with some form of dancing. Later it was sung and then recited. 5. Occasionally it has astonishing dramatic power. 6. The theme opens abruptly. There is no introductory matter. 7. The metrical structure is crude but pleasing. 8. Conventional epithets are employed. Repetition and refrain are generally present. 9. The 4-line stanza is generally used, only the second and fourth lines rhyming. Para. Some famous ballads are The Wife of Usher's Well, Chevy Chase, King John and the Abbot of Canterbury, Keats' La Belle Dame Sans Mercy, Coleridge's The Rime of Ancient Marina, and Christabel, Browning's How They Brought the Good News from Ghent to I, and Lord Tennyson's The Defence of Lucknow. Para. The mock ballad serves the same purpose as the mock epic. Cowper's John Gilpin and Calverley's Striking are memorable mock ballads.